The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for being here for this very important hearing on global persecution of Christians. I just would note parenthetically that I chaired my first hearing when I became chairman of the Human Rights Committee back in the mid-1990s, when we recognized that there was an explosion of persecution, harassment, and discrimination against Christians occurring worldwide. And so since 1995 and today, almost 20 years, it has gone from bad to extraordinarily worse. So that's why we're having this hearing. I would also note to my colleagues that we've had many country-specific hearings over the years and over the last several months, including one on Syria, 3 on the Coptic Christians, and some regional hearings, but this one is to look at the global reach. There is a dangerous, and I would suggest a frightening phenomenon occurring globally in the persecution of Christians. Today's focus on anti-Christian persecution is not meant to minimize the suffering of other religious minorities who are imprisoned or killed for their beliefs. As the poet John Donne once wrote, "Any man's death doth diminish me." We stand for human dignity and respect for life from the womb to tomb, and this subcommittee has and will continue to highlight the sufferings of religious minorities around the globe, be they Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan, Baha'i in Iran, Buddhists in occupied Tibet, Yazidis in Iraq, or Muslim Rohingyas people in Burma. Christians, however, remain the most persecuted religious group in the world over, and thus deserve the special attention that today's hearing will provide them. As one of today's witnesses, the distinguished journalist John Allen has written, and I quote him, "Christians today indisputably are the most persecuted religious body on the planet, and too often their martyrs suffer in silence." Researchers from the Pew Center have documented incidents of harassment of religious groups worldwide, a term defined as including, quote, physical assaults, arrests and detentions, desecration of holy sites, and discrimination against religious groups in employment, education, and housing. And it has concluded that Christians are the single most harassed group today. In the year 2012, Pew reports Christians were harassed in 110 countries around the world. This is particularly true in the Middle East, where one of those we will hear from today, Archbishop Francis Chullikat, has said, and I quote him, "Flagrant and widespread persecutions of Christians rages even as we meet." Archbishop Chullikat was the papal nuncio to Iraq, where he has seen repeated violent assaults on Christians, such as the October 31st, 2010 assault upon Our Lady of Deliverance Syrian Catholic Church in Baghdad, in which 58 people were killed and another 70 were wounded. Attacks such as this have led the Christian population of Iraq, whose roots date back to the time of the apostles, to dwindle from 1.4 million in 1987, prior to the First Gulf War, to as little as 150,000 today, according to some estimates. Much of this exodus has occurred during a time in which our country invested heavily in blood and treasure in seeking to help Iraqis build a democracy. As we witness the black flag of al-Qaeda again flying over cities such as Fallujah, which we had won at the cost of so much American blood, we wonder how it is that for Christians in Iraq, life appears to be worse now than it was under the vicious dictator Saddam Hussein. If we turn to Egypt, we see a Christian population which dates back to the Apostle St. Mark, also being oppressed. At a hearing we held on December 10th, Human Rights Day, we heard how churches had been subjected to mob attacks and burned. For example, in April of 2012, St. Mark's Cathedral, seat of the Coptic Pope, was attacked by 30 to 40 Muslim youths. While dozens of Copts were sheltering inside, security forces didn't stop, joined the mob. Rather than dispensing the crowd, they participated in the all-night attack, or stood idly by as rocks, gasoline bombs, and gas canisters were lobbed, into the iconic cathedral. I call your attention to the photographs of churches in Egypt to illustrate the outrages perpetrated against Christians simply for being Christian. Likewise, last year, this subcommittee held a hearing on the persecution of religious minorities in Syria. Syria has been a place of relative tolerance for religious minorities in the Middle East, including groups like the Mandeans, who trace their roots to the time of St. John the Baptist, with whom they still revere. It is in this connection with the past which has helped bring radical Islamists to Syria, where not only do they seek to overthrow the violent dictator Bashar al-Assad, but also seek to eradicate Christianity from the land. I would note parenthetically that when asked, our panel of NGO witnesses said to a group that what's happening in Iraq constitutes a genocide against Christians. Last September, members of the al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda-linked group, attacked the town of Malua. Why is this significant? It's because Malua is a living link with the time of Christ, a Christian village in Syria where Aramaic, the language of Jesus, is still spoken. It is for this reason that Malua has been targeted, in the words of one of those attacking this small village, whose way of life had remained largely unchanged over the centuries. The Mujahideen are seeking to, quote, conquer, this is their quote, the capital of the Crusaders. Such is the perspective of one whose vision has been distorted by hatred. But it is not just in the Middle East where we see the persecution of Christians. I would like to recall one story of one man that I met in September, along with Greg Simpkins, our Chief of Staff on the subcommittee, when we were in Jos, Nigeria. And then in Washington, when we held a hearing on the terror group Boko Haram last October. It was in the face of this man that I was able to witness the face of the persecuted church once again, which indeed is also the face of Christ. Habila Adamu is a businessman from Yobe State in northern Nigeria. On the night of November 28, 2012, masked gunmen arrived with AK-47s and entered his home. They told his wife to leave, and they were there to do the, quote, work of Allah. The questioning began. Are you a policeman? He said, no. Are you a Nigerian soldier? He said, no. Are you a Christian? He said, yes. Then they asked him why he has not accepted Islam, which he has heard when he has heard the message of Muhammad. He replied, I am a Christian. We are also preaching the gospel of the true God to you and to other people who do not yet know God. They then asked Habila, are you ready to die as a Christian? He said, I am ready to die as a Christian. They asked him again, are you ready to die as a Christian? He replied, I am ready. And before he had closed his mouth, a bullet ripped through him. You could see the exit point of the wound in the photo before you. And he sat right there at our witness table and told his story. And you could have heard a pin drop in this hearing room as he related to us what he had been through. I thought while he was testifying, how many of us would I have the courage to stare martyrdom in the face and refuse to renounce Christ? And he amazingly professed nothing but love and a sense of reconciliation, even for those who had so badly mistreated him, and his face is still, as you would expect, very badly scarred. Habila Adamu, by the grace of God, as I said, he did survive and testify. The term hero is one thrown around loosely these days. He is truly a hero. And there are so many more like him, many whose names we don't know and are known only to God. We will hear today stories from around the world where Christians are under attack, again, simply because of the beliefs that they profess. We'll hear witnesses discuss persecution in places such as Burma, Vietnam, Eritrea, even in this hemisphere. According to some estimates, China is on track to become the largest Christian nation in the world, though members are hard to pin down because most of these Christians remain underground and cannot worship freely. As U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom Commissioner Elliot Abrams points out in his testimony, independent Protestants and Catholics continue to face persecution for refusing to affiliate with government-approved religious groups. Protestant house church groups that refuse to join the state-approved Protestant religious organizations are deemed illegal and experience harassment, fines, detention, and imprisonment, and torture. Approximately 900 Protestants were detained in the past year for conducting public worship activities. 7 Protestant leaders were also in prison for terms exceeding a year. The Chinese government issued a directive to eradicate unregistered Protestant churches over the next 10 years, including through force. Police have embraced the plan, raiding meetings, seeking to break up large churches that previously operated openly, and detaining religious leaders. They are on a tear. It has gotten worse in China. It has not gotten better. I would note again parenthetically, Frank Wolf and I, right before the Olympics, went to China to meet with a number of house church leaders. Every one of them were arrested, detained, roughed up, and the one that we did meet with after the fact, he too was persecuted simply for meeting with two congressmen, simply for trying to live out their faith as they see fit. The Chinese government continues to appoint bishops without Vatican approval and place them in leadership positions, setting back Vatican-Beijing relations. Dozens of Catholic clergy, including 3 bishops, remain in detention, in home confinement under surveillance, or have disappeared. Bishop Thaddeus Ma Daquan, the auxiliary bishop of Shanghai, has been missing since he publicly announced his resignation from the state-approved Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association in June of 2012. Bishop Xu of Baoding, picture right over there on the extreme left. I met with him in the early 1990s. He had already spent several decades in the Laogai. He was tortured, and yet this man had nothing but a sense of love and reconciliation towards his tormentors. And a few months later, he was rearrested. A few years later, he was arrested and now has disappeared, and we don't know where he is. He may even be dead at the hands of his captors. When he celebrated Mass in a dingy little apartment, there was nothing, not even the slightest hint of malice in Bishop Xu's eyes or words. He prayed for his tormentors. I was dumbfounded by that faith. It just totally inspired. In Vietnam, today, one of these countries where churches are forced to register and worship outside of state-authorized churches is forbidden. Christian ethnic minorities, such as the Hmong and Montagnard, are allowed to exist in uneasy tension with the governing authorities, knowing that the heavy hand of the state could stop their worship at any time. Vietnam's Catholic, both clergy and laity, filled Vietnamese jails as prisoners of conscience for calling the government to account to a higher law than that of arbitrary dictates. The attack on the Catholic funeral procession in the village of Con Dao in 2010 resulted in more than 100 villagers being injured, 62 arrested, 5 tortured, and at least 3 deaths. This should remind one of the brutality that Christians face in Vietnam. As I mentioned Vietnam, because now, in secrecy, negotiations are being held over the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Vietnam seeks entry, and if we focus on the utility and profits of increased trade without holding Vietnam to account for its human rights record, we miss an opportunity to better the lives of those who are beaten, imprisoned, and even killed for their faith. I met Father Lee when he was under house arrest. Father Lee is now back in custody. And if you ever, and we'll bring it down, we have a picture of him while he was before the magistrate. And secret police are holding his face, and this man, this great Christian Catholic leader who wants nothing but democracy and religious freedom for his country, has been beaten, and he, along with so many others of different faiths in Vietnam, continue to languish in the prisons throughout Vietnam. I would like to thank our witnesses for most of them traveled here to be with us today from great distances and at their own expense. It's important to hear from voices from outside the Beltway, and we appreciate our witnesses coming here from as far away as India, the United Kingdom, Mexico, and from within the United States, from Denver and from New York. And unless we appear ungrateful, thanks to the incomparable U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and especially its commissioner here today, Elliot Abrams, who I and members of this committee have known for over 3 decades. He once walked point as Assistant Secretary for Human Rights under the Reagan administration. Thank him for his extraordinary leadership over these many years. And one brief word about protocol and procedure. We will hear from Archbishop Francis Chulacot, the representative of the Holy See to the United Nations. As Archbishop Chulacot holds the equivalent of the rank of ambassador, he will not be testifying in the purest sense of that word, but rather briefing Congress this morning pursuant to our House rules, and he will, and we will then go to our other witnesses when we reconvene as a hearing. And I would like to say Frank Wolf is here, and the USERF was created by the legislation that he wrote back in 1998, landmark legislation called the International Religious Freedom Act. I want to thank him for his extraordinary leadership over these many years. And again, Elliot Abrams is now here as part of that commission, and I thank him again for his leadership. I'd like to yield to Dana Rohrabacher, Chairman Rohrabacher, for any comments he might have.